The silence in Department 47 of the San Francisco Superior Court was heavy enough to crack the polished mahogany benches. For 3 agonizing weeks, Sarah Sterling had sat under the flickering fluorescent lights, enduring the humiliation of being dismantled piece by piece. Her billionaire husband's legal team had painted her as a leech, a woman whose greatest accomplishment was scheduling Pilates and picking out drapes. They called her just a housewife, the gallery whispered. Her husband smirked. But then the Honorable Judge Thomas Albright leaned over his elevated desk, adjusted his reading glasses, and asked one single quiet question. And in 3 seconds, a $400 million empire came crashing down. No one looked at Sarah Sterling and saw a titan of industry, dressed in a tailored but understated navy blazer. Her dark hair pulled into a neat, unpretentious knot. She looked exactly like what her husband's high-priced legal team claimed she was. A woman who had lived a very comfortable life on someone else's dime. Across the aisle sat Richard Sterling. Richard was the kind of man who walked into a room and expected the air to shift around him. He was the founder and CEO of Aegis Logistics, a supply chain software company that had revolutionized freight tracking across North America. He was a regular feature in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal, lauded as a visionary. A maverick, a self-made genius. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than most people's cars, and he spent the majority of the trial whispering and sharing quiet, arrogant smiles with his lead counsel, Arthur Pendleton. Arthur Pendleton was a shark in a silk tie. He charged $2,000 an hour and had a reputation for leaving the spouses of tech billionaires with pennies on the dollar. His strategy from day one of the divorce proceedings had been simple, brutal, and profoundly effective: diminish, degrade, and dismiss. The divorce had not been Sarah's idea. 14 months prior, on the morning of their 16th wedding anniversary, Richard had sat her down in the kitchen of their 12,000-square-foot Pacific Heights mansion. He hadn't even had the grace to look guilty. He simply stated that he had outgrown the marriage, that his life was moving at a velocity she couldn't match, and that he was moving out. Within 48 hours, she learned about Chloe, a 26-year-old public relations executive for Aegis. Within a week, Sarah found herself locked out of their primary bank accounts, her credit cards severely restricted, and a severance-like settlement offer of $5 million shoved across a boardroom table. $5 million was a lot of money to an ordinary person. But Aegis Logistics was valued at nearly $500 million. Because the company had technically been incorporated just months before they officially married, Richard and his legal team claimed it was separate property. They claimed Sarah had zero stake in the company's massive success. "She raised the children which we value," Pendleton had stated in his opening remarks, his voice dripping with practiced condescension. "She kept a beautiful home, she hosted lovely dinner parties." But this court must separate the sentimental value of a homemaker from the cold, hard reality of corporate creation. Richard Sterling built Aegis Logistics with his intellect, his sweat, and his vision. Mrs. Sterling was simply a passenger in first class. Sitting beside her own attorney, a sharp, quiet woman named Evelyn Cross, Sarah kept her hands folded in her lap. She didn't cry. She didn't react to the whispers from the journalists sitting in the back row. She just watched Richard. What the court didn't know, what the media didn't know, and what Richard had conveniently chosen to forget was the reality of the first 5 years of Aegis Logistics. They didn't know about the tiny, unair-conditioned apartment in San Jose where the company was born. They didn't know that while Richard was the charismatic face who pitched to investors, he was a chaotic mess behind closed doors. He couldn't balance a ledger to save his life. He didn't understand tax law, corporate structuring, or payroll management. Sarah had a degree in forensic accounting, a detail. Richard's team conveniently omitted from their narrative, focusing instead on her years as a stay-at-home mother to their 2 children. During the early days, while Richard slept or played golf with venture capitalists, Sarah had been the one awake at 3 in the morning, meticulously building the financial architecture of Aegis. She had set up the holding companies. She had navigated the complex international tax laws when they expanded into Europe. She was the ghost in the machine, but there was no title on her door. There were no emails proving her work, because she had done it all over Richard's shoulder, using his login, operating under his name to build his mythos. She had loved him, and she had wanted him to succeed. Now he was using that very love to destroy her. "Let them talk," Evelyn murmured to Sarah, jotting down a note on her legal pad as Pendleton droned on about Richard's genius. The bigger the balloon they inflate, the louder the pop. The second week of the trial was a grueling exercise in public humiliation. It was time for Sarah to take the stand. Arthur Pendleton approached the podium like a predator circling wounded prey. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His weapon was a quiet, relentless minimization of Sarah's entire existence. "Mrs. Sterling," Pendleton began, adjusting his spectacles, "let's review your schedule from the year 2021, arguably the most critical year of growth for Aegis Logistics. According to your shared digital calendar, on Tuesdays and Thursdays, you attended a 90-minute Pilates class at 10 in the morning. Is that correct?" "Yes," Sarah said, her voice steady. "And afterward you frequently had lunch at the country club with other wives of tech executives. Then perhaps a visit to a high-end boutique or a spa. Would you say this was a typical week?" "It was a part of my week, yes," Sarah replied, refusing to look down. "I see." Pendleton pulled up a large presentation board showing a timeline. "During this exact same period, your husband was negotiating a $70 million buyout of a rival firm in Seattle. He was working 100-hour weeks. He was sleeping in his office. Did you ever sleep in the office, Mrs. Sterling?" "No. I slept at home with our children." "Ah, the children. Yes. You have a full-time nanny, do you not?" "Maria? Maria helps with the household, yes. But I was the primary caregiver. But Maria cooked the meals. The housekeeping staff cleaned the home." "So, Mrs. Sterling, I am trying to understand your claim to half of a $400 million technology firm. Did you write a single line of code for Aegis' proprietary tracking algorithm?" "No," Sarah said. "Did you secure the Series A, B, or C funding rounds?" "I attended the dinners where the initial pitches were made, but I did not sign the term sheets." Pendleton offered a cold smile to the judge. "You attended the dinners as a hostess, making sure the wine glasses were full. Mrs. Sterling, it is an honorable thing to be a housewife. It is a necessary societal role. But let us not confuse planning a lovely dinner party with architecting a multinational corporate buyout. You're asking this court to award you $200 million for what amounts to party planning and attending Pilates. Isn't it true that your primary contribution to the wealth of this marriage was purely recreational?" Objection from Evelyn Cross, sustained by Judge Albright. But the damage was done. The narrative was set. The reporters in the gallery were already typing their headlines. "Billionaire's wife demands fortune for hosting dinner parties." Richard sat at his table, a look of profound pity on his face. It was the pity that hurt the most. He actually believed his own lie. He had spent so long telling the world he was a solitary genius that he had erased Sarah from his own memory. Evelyn Cross stood up for her redirect. She didn't look flustered. In fact, she looked almost bored. She walked over to Sarah. "Mrs. Sterling," Mr. Pendleton brought up the year 2021, the year of the Seattle buyout. "A very stressful time for your husband, correct?" "Incredibly stressful," Sarah agreed. "He was sleeping in the office, according to opposing counsel. Do you recall why he was sleeping in the office in October of that year?" Pendleton stood up, Objection, relevance. We have established Mr. Sterling's work ethic. Overruled, Judge Albright said, his eyes fixed on Sarah. You may answer. He was sleeping in the office because the IRS had flagged a massive discrepancy in how Aegis was reporting its international freight tariffs, Sarah said clearly. He was facing an audit that could have bankrupted the company. The courtroom went incredibly still. Richard's head snapped up. And how is that audit resolved? Evelyn asked, her voice calm. It was resolved because the corporate tax structure was legally rerouted for a subsidiary holding company in Delaware, which legally bypassed the tariff penalties, Sarah explained, her tone shifting from the soft-spoken wife to something sharper, colder. And who came up with that corporate structure, Mrs. Sterling? Richard was glaring at her now. Pendleton was frantically whispering to his junior associate. I did, Sarah said. My husband didn't know the difference between an S-corp and a C-corp. I drafted the incorporation papers on our kitchen island while he was having a panic attack in the living room. Pendleton jumped up. Objection! Hearsay! There is absolutely no documentary evidence to support this absurd fiction. Mrs. Sterling is a housewife, not a corporate tax attorney. Sustained, Judge Albright said, though his brow was furrowed. Unless you have documentation, Ms. Cross, move on. Nothing further at this time, Evelyn said, taking her seat. She didn't look defeated. She looked like a chess player who had just forced her opponent to sacrifice a knight. She leaned over to Sarah and whispered, We have him exactly where we want him. The atmosphere in Department 47 had shifted significantly by the time Richard Sterling took the stand. The arrogance was still there, but it was now laced with defensive aggression. He was determined to put his ex-wife back in her place once and for all. Under Pendleton's direct examination, Richard was brilliant. He charmed the room. He spoke passionately about his vision for Aegis logistics, painting himself as an American pioneer. He detailed his grueling schedule, the sacrifices he made, and the sheer weight of carrying a multi-million-dollar empire on his shoulders. He spoke of Sarah with patronizing fondness, framing her as a sweet, simple woman who simply didn't understand the complexities of the business world. I loved Sarah, Richard said, looking earnestly at the judge. I provided a beautiful life for her. But Aegis is my blood, sweat, and tears. It's my intellect. She didn't build it. She didn't manage it. She spent the money I made. Then it was Evelyn Cross's turn for cross-examination. Evelyn walked slowly to the podium carrying a single thick manila folder. She didn't start with fireworks. She started with agonizingly dry, mundane questions about corporate structures. Mr. Sterling, you've testified extensively about your sole stewardship of Aegis Logistics. You are the ultimate decision-maker, correct? Absolutely, Richard replied, leaning back in his chair. You understand every facet of your company's financial operations. I have a CFO, obviously, but yes, the buck stops with me. I architect the macro-financial strategy. Excellent. Evelyn opened the folder. Let's talk about your macro strategy regarding intellectual property. In 2018, Aegis Logistics transferred the patents for its core routing algorithm to a holding company. Do you recall this? Richard frowned slightly. Yes. Standard corporate protection. We placed the IP in a separate entity to shield it from liability. And what was the name of that holding company? Richard hesitated. He looked at Pendleton, who offered a subtle, tight nod. I believe it was called Blue Heron Holdings. Blue Heron Holdings, Evelyn repeated. She pulled a piece of paper from her folder and handed it to the bailiff to pass to the judge, and a copy to Pendleton. I am submitting Exhibit 404, Mr. Sterling. You are the sole managing member of Blue Heron Holdings, correct? Yes, and Blue Heron Holdings licenses the algorithm back to Aegis Logistics for an exorbitant annual fee, effectively draining Aegis's liquid profits and stockpiling them in Blue Heron, a company which, interestingly, was incorporated after you filed for divorce, meaning you claim it is entirely your separate property. Pendleton stood up, red in the face. Objection, this is a standard licensing agreement. Counsel is trying to frame standard business practices as nefarious. Overruled, Judge Albright said, staring intently at the document. I'll allow it. Proceed, Ms. Cross. Mr. Sterling, Evelyn continued, her voice dropping an octave. You claim you are the sole architect of this macro-financial strategy. Can you tell the court where Blue Heron Holdings is incorporated? Richard shifted in his seat. The relaxed posture was gone. I believe. Delaware. You believe? Evelyn raised an eyebrow. You are a genius CEO, Mr. Sterling. You don't know where your most valuable asset is housed. My legal team handles the specific filings. I focus on the big picture. I see. Evelyn pulled another document out. Would it surprise you to know that Blue Heron Holdings is not incorporated in Delaware? It is incorporated in the Cayman Islands. A murmur ran through the gallery. Richard swallowed hard. Like I said, my accountants. Your accountants, Evelyn interrupted. Mr. Sterling, let's look at the signature on the incorporation documents for Blue Heron Holdings in the Cayman Islands. Is that your signature? The bailiff handed Richard the document. He stared at it. It appears to be an electronic signature, yes. Authorized by me. Authorized by you. Evelyn took a step closer to the stand. The courtroom was dead silent. Mr. Sterling, to incorporate in the Cayman Islands under this specific tax shelter, the managing director has to pass a rigorous compliance interview. A recorded interview. Did you do that interview? Richard's face lost a fraction of its color. I do many interviews. I don't recall. You don't recall passing a 3-hour oral compliance exam regarding international tax shelters? Evelyn's voice was like ice. Or is it possible, Mr. Sterling, that you didn't do the interview because you don't actually know how your own company's finances work? Objection! Badgering! Pendleton shouted. I will rephrase, Evelyn said smoothly before the judge could rule. Mr. Pomplies, Mr. Pont Sterling, if you are the sole genius behind Aegis Logistics, can you explain to this court right now the difference between a pass-through entity and a controlled foreign corporation? Richard stared at her, his mouth open but no words came out. He looked at Pendleton. He looked at the judge. The silence stretched for 10 agonizing seconds. The swaggering enter was the first thing she truly knew first. No, I am not a CPA, Richard finally choked out. That is not my job. Evelyn smiled. It was a terrifying smile. No, Mr. Sterling. It's not. But someone set up those accounts. Someone passed that interview. And someone holds the physical security key to the encrypted servers in the Caymans. She turned and looked directly at Sarah, who was sitting perfectly straight, her eyes locked on the man who had tried to erase her. And I think, Evelyn said quietly, turning back to the judge, we are about to find out exactly who that is. The silence in Department 47 was absolute, possessing a heavy, suffocating quality that seemed to press the oxygen out of the room. It was the kind of silence that only occurs when a fundamental truth, previously universally accepted, is suddenly and violently shattered. Arthur Pendleton, the man whose courtroom presence was legendary for its unflappable arrogance, was standing at his table with his mouth slightly ajar, his gold cross pen suspended inches above his legal pad. Beside him, Richard Sterling looked as though the polished wooden witness stand had suddenly turned to quicksand beneath his bespoke Italian leather shoes. Judge Thomas Albright did not immediately speak. He possessed the seasoned patience of a jurist who had presided over the wreckage of Silicon Valley marriages for 2 decades. He had seen founders hide assets in crypto wallets, funnel funds through venture capital ghost entities, and execute complex offshore maneuvers. But the brazenness of this, the sheer, unadulterated hubris of a man claiming sole ownership of a labyrinthine corporate structure he couldn't even basically define, was rare. Judge Albright slowly removed his reading glasses, letting them drop against the chest of his black robes. Suspended by a thin black cord, he leaned forward, resting his forearms on the elevated mahogany desk, his gaze bypassing Evelyn Cross, bypassing Pendleton, and locking directly onto Richard. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Albright began, his voice barely above a conversational murmur, yet it carried to the furthest corners of the gallery. "Let me ensure I am fully understanding the testimony you have offered this court today. You are the founder and CEO of Aegis Logistics. You claim that you are the sole architect of the macro financial strategy, which includes the creation and management of Blue Heron Holdings, an entity that currently holds the proprietary patents of your company and, by extension, hundreds of millions of dollars in licensing fees." Richard swallowed audibly. The microphone picked up the dry clicking sound of his throat. "Yes, Your Honor. I am the CEO. I oversee everything." "You oversee everything," Albright repeated, rolling the phrase around as if testing its weight. "And yet you cannot recall the domicile of this multi-million-dollar holding company. You cannot articulate the tax classification under which it operates. You cannot recall participating in the legally mandated 3-hour Know Your Customer compliance interview required by the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority to establish such a trust. Is that an accurate summary of your testimony thus far?" Pendleton scrambled to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "Your Honor, my client is a visionary software engineer, not a forensic tax specialist. It is entirely standard industry practice for a CEO to delegate the minutiae of international tax filings to a dedicated financial team. To penalize him for not knowing the granular details of a CIMA compliance interview is—" "Mr. Pendleton, sit down," Judge Albright commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. "I am not asking about minutiae. I'm asking about the genesis of the marital estate's single largest asset." Pendleton slowly lowered himself into his chair. His face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. Albright turned his attention back to Richard. The judge's eyes were sharp, evaluating the man not as a billionaire, but as a witness caught in a dangerous web of his own spinning. And then Judge Albright asked the one question that would effectively rewrite the history of Aegis Logistics. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Albright said quietly, "if you are the sole managing member of Blue Heron Holdings, as you swore under oath 10 minutes ago, you are legally the only individual authorized to access the master ledger and initiate transfers. If I were to order a laptop brought to this bench right now, connected to the court's secure server, could you log into the Blue Heron Holdings portal and prove your ownership?" The courtroom held its collective breath. In the back row, a reporter from the Wall Street Journal stopped typing, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Richard's eyes darted wildly, seeking an escape route. He looked at Pendleton, who was furiously writing a note, refusing to meet his client's eye. He looked at Evelyn Cross, who stood perfectly still, her face an unreadable mask of professional detachment. And finally, inevitably, his eyes drifted towards Sarah. Sarah sat at the petitioner's table, her posture perfect, her hands still folded neatly in her lap. She didn't offer him a smirk. She didn't offer him a glare. She merely looked at him with the profound, devastating pity of a creator watching her creation fail. "Your Honor," Richard stammered, a thin sheen of sweat appearing on his forehead. The security protocols for an account of that magnitude are incredibly stringent. It's not a simple username and password. There are physical security keys, biometric authenticators. It's handled by the Swiss vaulting firm, Harrington and Locke. I don't carry the access tokens on my person. I am aware of Harrington and Locke's protocols, Mr. Sterling, Judge Albright said, his tone turning frigid. They require a dual authentication YubiKey and a dynamic 256-bit encryption passphrase. a passphrase that, according to their own corporate bylaws, is only generated by and known to the primary architect of the account. So, I will ask you one more time. Do you know the master passphrase, Mr. Sterling? Richard gripped the edges of the witness stand. The charismatic titan of industry had evaporated, leaving behind a terrified man who had spent 15 years reading from a script he didn't write. I would need to consult with my chief financial officer, Richard whispered, the fight completely draining out of him. Judge Albright held his gaze for 3 agonizing seconds before nodding slowly. I see. He turned his attention to Evelyn Cross. Miss Cross, you brought this specific line of questioning to the court's attention. I assume you have a destination in mind? I do, Your Honor, Evelyn said, stepping out from behind her podium. I request permission to recall Mrs. Mutton. Sarah Sterling to the stand. Objection! Pendleton roared, surging to his feet again. This is a circus. Mrs. Sterling has already testified. Opposing counsel is attempting to ambush my client with irrelevant financial trivia to obscure the fact that Mrs. Miss Rand Sterling contributed nothing to the operational value of Aegis Logistics. Mr. Pendleton, Judge Albright said softly, a dangerous edge to his voice. If your client cannot access the $200 million offshore account that he claims to have built, and opposing counsel implies her client can, I would say that is the furthest thing from irrelevant trivia. Objection overruled. Mr. Sterling, you may step down. Mrs. Sterling, please retake the stand. Richard descended from the witness box like a man walking to the gallows. He stumbled slightly on the wooden step, his legendary poise completely shattered. As he passed Sarah, she didn't even flinch. She rose smoothing the front of her navy blazer and walked to the stand. She raised her right hand, swore the oath again, and sat down. The lighting in the courtroom seemed to catch her differently now. She was no longer the diminished housewife fighting for scraps. She was the ghost stepping out of the machine, fully materialized and terrifyingly solid. Evelyn Cross did not use the podium. She walked directly to the center of the courtroom floor, standing between Sarah and Richard's table. Mrs. Sterling, Evelyn began, her voice ringing clear and confident in the hushed room. You heard your husband testify that Blue Heron Holdings is managed by the Swiss firm Harrington & Locke, and that it requires a highly specific set of security protocols to access. Is his testimony accurate regarding those protocols? Not. It is accurate regarding the protocols, Sarah replied calmly. It is inaccurate regarding who holds them. Could you elaborate for the court? Sarah adjusted the microphone slightly. When she spoke, the soft, deferential tone of the first week of trial was gone. It was replaced by the crisp, authoritative cadence of the forensic accountant who knew she was the smartest person in the room. When Aegis Logistics secured its Series B funding in 2018, Sarah explained, Richard brought home the term sheets. The venture capital firm, a syndicate out of New York, demanded a restructuring of our intellectual property. They wanted the patent separated from the operational liabilities of the logistics firm. It's a standard move to protect the core technology in case the delivery fleet faces catastrophic litigation. Judge Albright nodded, following along intently. Standard corporate shielding. Exactly, Your Honor, Sarah continued. However, Richard CFO at the time, a man who has since been fired, suggested routing the IP through a domestic C corporation in Nevada. I reviewed his proposal and realized it would expose the licensing revenue to a double taxation penalty that would effectively bleed 30% of the company's liquid capital over 10 years. Pendleton snorted loudly from his table. Oh, the housewife was reviewing corporate tax strategy. Fascinating fiction. Judge Albright didn't even look at Pendleton. Counsel, if you interrupt this witness again with commentary, I will hold you in contempt. Continue, Mrs. Sterling. Thank you, Your Honor, Fair Sarah said, her eyes briefly flicking to Pendleton before returning to her attorney. I told Richard the Nevada plan was flawed. I spent 3 weeks researching international tax domiciles. I reached out to a former colleague of mine, David Carmichael, who was a senior compliance director at Deloitte. With his unofficial guidance, I designed the corporate architecture for Blue Heron Holdings to be domiciled in the Cayman Islands, leveraging a specific regulatory loophole regarding software-as-a-service licensing across international borders. The courtroom was spellbound. Even Richard's junior attorneys were staring at Sarah with wide eyes. And the compliance interview? Evelyn prompted. The one, Mr. Sterling could not recall. The CIMA interview was conducted via secure teleconference on November 14, 2018, Sarah stated, her memory flawless. It lasted 3 hours and 45 minutes. I conducted the interview. I answered every technical question regarding the transfer pricing agreements, the nominee directors, and the capitalization tables. Because Richard was legally the CEO of the parent company, his electronic signature was required on the final documents, which I obtained via DocuSign while he was on a golf trip in Carmel. But I am the authorized architect. Do you have proof of this, Mrs. Sterling? Evelyn asked, moving toward her table to retrieve a small black velvet pouch. I do, Sarah said. Evelyn walked to the witness stand and handed the pouch to Sarah. Sarah opened it and withdrew a small brushed steel USB device, a YubiKey. This is a localized cryptographic hardware authenticator, Sarah explained, holding the small device up for the judge to see. It is registered under a pseudonym with Harrington and Locke. It generates a rotating, time-sensitive access token. However, the token alone is useless without the master passphrase, which serves as the decryption key for the Harrington and Locke bot portal. Judge Albright leaned forward, his eyes locked on the small piece of metal. And you know this passphrase, Mrs. Sterling? I created it, Your Honor, and it is not written down anywhere in the world. It exists only in my head. Evelyn turned to the judge. Your Honor, I have a secure, air-gapped laptop at my table, provided by an independent cybersecurity firm, cleared by the bailiff this morning. I request permission to have Mrs. Sterling demonstrate her access. Pendleton stood up, visibly shaking. Your Honor, I strongly object. This is a severe breach of protocol. For all we know, she hacked her husband's computer, stole this device, and memorized his password. This proves nothing other than she is a proficient cybercriminal. Sarah didn't wait for Evelyn to defend her. She looked directly at Arthur Pendleton, her voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. Mr. Pendleton, if I stole this password from my husband, then surely he can tell you what it is. It's a mnemonic phrase, 24 characters long, utilizing alphanumeric symbols and specific capitalization. It is the single most important security key in his entire billionaire empire. So ask him what it is. If he can write it down on a piece of paper right now, I will forfeit every single claim I have to Aegis Logistics and walk out of this courtroom with nothing. The silence returned, heavier and more violent than before. Every single pair of eyes in Department 47 turned to Richard Sterling. Pendleton looked down at his client, his face pale. Richard, Pendleton hissed, entirely forgetting to mute his microphone. Give me the phrase. Richard sat paralyzed. He looked at the legal pad in front of him. He looked at the pen in his hand. His fingers twitched, but he didn't write. He couldn't. He looked up, his eyes meeting Sarah's across the room. In that singular moment, the grand illusion of Richard Sterling shattered completely. He was not a titan. He was not a self-made genius. He was a charismatic frontman who had spent a decade taking credit for the quiet, brilliant, exhausting labor of the woman he had discarded like an old coat. I don't know it, Richard whispered into the microphone. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Judge Albright let out a long, slow exhale. Permission granted, Miss Cross. Bring the laptop to the witness stand. The bailiff carried the heavy, ruggedized laptop to Sarah, placing it on the wooden ledge in front of her. Evelyn plugged a secondary monitor in, angling it so the judge and the opposing counsel could see the screen. Sarah inserted the brushed steel UB key into the sideboard. She didn't hesitate. Her fingers flew across the keyboard with the rapid, practiced muscle memory of someone who had performed this exact sequence 1,000 times in the dead of night while her husband slept. She tapped the UB key to authenticate the physical prompt. Then she typed the 24-character passphrase. She hit enter. On the secondary monitor, the screen went black for a fraction of a second before resolving into a pristine, white interface bearing the gold crest of Harrington & Locke, Zurich. In the top right corner, the account name read BLU Her & Holdings, LLC. Beneath it, the current liquid balance $214,876,400 USD. And in the center of the screen, the system greeted its master. "Welcome back, architect." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The journalists were writing furiously, their pens tearing into their notepads. "Mrs. Sterling," Judge Albright said, his voice laced with profound respect. "Can you show us the digital ledger? The creation history?" "Of course, Your Honor," Sarah said, navigating through the menus with clinical precision. She pulled up the raw metadata files for the account's inception. As you can see here, the account was initialized on November 15, 2018. The IP address associated with the creation logs matches the static IP of the Secure Home Office network at our Pacific Heights residence. The secondary authorization email routed directly to my encrypted Proton Mail account. She clicked another tab, pulling up a series of internal memos and transfer logs. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Sarah continued, turning to face the bench, "you will see that over the past 4 years, every single transfer of intellectual property licensing fees from Aegis Logistics to Blue Heron Holdings was executed using this exact administrative credential. I executed every transfer. I balanced every offshore ledger." Richard pitched the software to the clients. "Yes, he is a phenomenal salesman, but I built the vault that held the money. I engineered the architecture that kept Aegis solvent during the 2021 IRS audit. I am not a passenger, Your Honor." "True." Sarah looked directly at Richard, her voice ringing with 14 years of deferred vindication. "I am the engine." Arthur Pendleton sank into his chair, dropping his head into his hands. His $2,000 an hour defense had just been immolated in real time. He knew with the cold certainty of a seasoned lawyer that he had lost. The separate property argument was dead. Aegis Logistics was a marital asset, built on the invisible, unpaid labor of a woman they had tried to dismiss as a housewife. Judge Albright folded his hands together, looking down at Richard Sterling, who was staring blankly at the Swiss bank interface on the monitor. "Mr. Pendleton," Judge Albright said, his tone devoid of any sympathy, "given the spectacular nature of the evidence just presented, and your client's astonishing inability to identify the foundational security protocols of his own alleged property, I suggest you ask the court for a brief recess. You and your client have a tremendous amount of reevaluating to do regarding your settlement offer, because as of this moment your argument that Mrs. Sterling is entitled to a mere $5 million is not only legally offensive, it is empirically absurd." The judge slammed his gavel down, the shot crack echoing like thunder. "We are in recess until 2 o'clock. Sarah Sterling quietly unplugged her YubiKey, slipped it back into the velvet pouch, and stood up. She didn't look back at her husband as she walked out of the courtroom, the heavy mahogany doors swinging shut behind her, leaving the ruins of a billionaire's ego in her wake. The walls of the Turney Conference Room B on the 4th floor of the courthouse were supposedly soundproof, but they could not contain the sheer magnitude of Arthur Pendleton's fury. The moment the heavy oak door clicked shut, Pendleton hurled his $2,000 leather briefcase onto the glass conference table. It hit with a deafening crack, sliding across the surface and knocking over a plastic pitcher of water. Water spilled onto the carpet, but neither man moved to clean it up. Richard Sterling stood by the window, staring blankly out at the San Francisco skyline. The bespoke charcoal suit that had looked like armor at 9 o'clock that morning now hung on his frame, as if he had physically shrunk. His face was ash-white. "You lied to me," Pendleton said, his voice a lethal, vibrating whisper. "You sat in my office for 14 months. You paid me nearly $2 million in retainer fees, and you lied to my face." "I didn't lie," Richard snapped, though his voice lacked its usual booming authority. "I am the CEO. I make the decisions. She handled the paperwork." "The paperwork?" Pendleton barked a harsh, incredulous laugh. "She holds the decryption key to $250 million in offshore assets, Richard. She holds the patent rights to your entire company's operational algorithm. You don't even know the name of the tax shelter you're operating under. Do you have any idea what you just did in there?" "We can spin it," Richard said desperately, turning away from the window. "We tell the judge she acted as a rogue administrative assistant. She overstepped. She hijacked the account protocols." "Stop talking," Pendleton ordered, pressing his fingers hard against his temples. "Just stop. There is no spin. You committed perjury, Richard. You sat under oath and claimed Blue Heron Holdings was formed after the divorce to shield it as separate property. She just proved it was formed in 2018 during the marriage and that you authorized it. That is fraud. That is perjury. Judge Albright is currently sitting in his chambers deciding whether to simply give her all your money or to also refer you to the United States Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution." Before Richard could formulate a response, the heavy door handle clicked. The door swung open and Evelyn Cross walked in, followed quietly by Sarah. Sarah looked exactly as she had all week, calm, understated, her navy blazer immaculate. But the energy in the room shifted violently upon her entrance. She was no longer the discarded spouse, she was the executioner. Pendleton immediately straightened his tie, instinctively trying to salvage some fragment of his professional dominance. "Evelyn, this is highly irregular. We are in the middle of attorney-client consultation. The munt na thou mau well bum oats." "We're skipping the posturing, Arthur," Evelyn said, pulling out a chair and sitting down. She didn't invite Sarah to sit. Sarah chose to stand behind the chair, her hands resting lightly on the backrest, observing Richard. "We have 45 minutes before Judge Albright retakes the bench. You and I both know exactly how this ends if we go back in there and let him issue a ruling." Pendleton swallowed hard. "My client is prepared to offer a revised settlement. In light of the shared nature of the holding company, we are willing to concede a 50-50 split of the liquid assets in Blue Heron Holding. That is $107 million, tax-free. We will also concede the primary residence in Pacific Heights." "Nato." Richard flinched at the loss of the house, but he kept his mouth shut. Evelyn didn't write the offer down. She didn't even look at Pendleton. She looked at Sarah. "Richard," Sarah said quietly. It was the first time she had spoken directly to him in a private setting in over a year. The sound of his name in her mouth made him visibly stiffen. "Sarah, please," Richard began, trying to summon the old charm, the persuasive cadence that had won over venture capitalists for a decade. "We don't need to destroy everything we built. I admit I lost sight of things. The stress of the company, the expansion. I didn't give you the credit you deserved. Let's take the $100 million. You and the kids will never want for anything again." Cool. And you. "I was never going to want for anything, Richard," Sarah replied, her voice smooth and cold. "Because I built the safety net. While you were busy buying a Porsche for Chloe and flying her to Aspen on the company jet, I was maintaining the structural integrity of Aegis Logistics." Richard's jaw tightened at the mention of his 26-year-old mistress. "Here is the reality of your situation," Sarah continued, stepping around the chair. "Aegis Logistics is a hollow shell. Its entire valuation is based on the proprietary routing algorithm. But Aegis doesn't own that algorithm. Blue Heron Holdings does. And as we just established in open court, I am the sole managing architect of Blue Heron, which means I own the algorithm. Pendleton intervened. Now, Mrs. Sterling, let's not overstate the legal reality. The Mudtwistist owns the holding company. A judge will divide it equitably. A judge will do whatever he wants to a man who just lied to his face, Evelyn countered sharply. But let's talk about the board of directors. Let's talk about William Hastings and the New York Syndicate. What do you think Bill Hastings is going to do when he reads the court transcript tomorrow? When he finds out that his visionary CEO is a fraud who doesn't even know his own password? The board will force you out by Friday, Richard. Aegis stock will plummet. The company will be worthless in a month. Richard leaned heavily against the glass table. What do you want, Sarah? I don't want half the money, Sarah said. I want the machinery. She reached into her blazer pocket, pulled out a neatly folded document, and placed it on the damp glass table. This is an irrevocable restructuring agreement, Evelyn explained, tapping the paper. Sarah will assume 100% ownership and voting control of Blue Heron Holdings. She takes the entire $214 million, and she takes sole ownership of the patents. Are you out of your minds? Pendleton exploded. That leaves my client with nothing but a logistics shell company holding zero liquid assets. It leaves him with a job, Sarah corrected softly. Aegis Logistics will retain its operational status, but Aegis will sign a permanent ironclad licensing agreement with Blue Heron. You will pay my company 30% of your gross annual revenue to use the algorithm. You get to keep your title, Richard. You get to stay the CEO. You get to keep doing your magazine interviews and pretending you're a genius. But you work for me now. Richard stared at her, horrified. You want to make me your employee? I want to make you accountable, Sarah said, her eyes boring into his. You told the world I was just a housewife. You told this court my only value was scheduling Pilates and picking out drapes. You tried to erase my mind, my labor, and my contribution, simply because you wanted to sleep with a 26-year-old PR assistant and play bachelor. She leaned in closer, the scent of her subtle perfume cutting through the stale air of the conference room. If you don't sign that paper right now, Sarah whispered, we go back in there. Evelyn asks the judge to refer the transcripts to the SEC for corporate fraud and the IRS for tax evasion. You won't just lose the company, Richard. You will go to federal prison. And Chloe will not wait for you. The silence in the room was absolute. The ticking of Pendleton's Rolex was the only sound. Richard looked at Pendleton. Pendleton, a man who had made a career out of destroying spouses, slowly closed his eyes and gave a single defeated nod. There was no defense against the truth, especially when it was backed by a loaded gun. Richard's hands were shaking as he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his gold fountain pen. He didn't read the document. He couldn't bear to look at the words. He flipped to the signature page and violently scratched his name onto the line, pressing so hard the nib of the pen tore the heavy paper. He threw the pen onto the table and turned his back to them, staring out the window once more. Sarah smoothly picked up the document, checked the signature, and handed it to Evelyn. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. I'll see you in court, Mr. Sterling, Sarah said, and walked out the door. At precisely 2 o'clock, the heavy mahogany doors of Department 47 swung open. The gallery was packed tighter than it had been all morning. Word had spread through the courthouse that something catastrophic had happened to the Aegis Logistics billionaire. Journalists were practically sitting on top of each other, their laptops glowing in the dim light. Sarah sat at the petitioner's table, her posture impeccable. Evelyn Cross sat beside her, organizing files with the serene satisfaction of a general who had conquered a continent without firing a single bullet. Across the aisle, the defense table looked like a wake. Richard Sterling stared blankly at the grain of the wood. Arthur Pendleton looked as though he had aged a decade in 45 minutes. All rise, the bailiff bellowed. Judge Thomas Albright emerged from his chambers, his black robes billowing as he ascended to the bench. He sat, adjusted his reading glasses, and looked out over the silent room. His piercing gaze lingered on Richard before shifting to the defense attorney. "Mr. Pendleton," Judge Albright said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space, "before the recess, your client's testimony regarding the foundational architecture of the marital assets had spectacularly unraveled. Have you re-evaluated your position?" Arthur Pendleton stood. He did not puff out his chest. "We have, Your Honor," Pendleton said, his voice tight. "The parties engaged in intensive negotiations. We've reached a comprehensive settlement agreement that resolves all issues of property division and corporate ownership." A massive murmur erupted from the gallery. Reporters frantically began typing. "A settlement? After a 2-week bloodbath?" Judge Albright banged his gavel. "Order. Mr. Firth, Pendleton, you are formally withdrawing your claim that Blue Heron Holdings is the separate property of your client?" "Yes, Your Honor. Withdrawn entirely." "Now, yeah. And the terms of this settlement?" Evelyn Cross stood. "Your Honor, I have the signed stipulation. Mrs. Sarah Sterling will assume 100% ownership, voting rights, and total control of Blue Heron Holdings, including the $214 million in liquid assets currently bolted with Harrington and Law. Furthermore, Mrs. Sterling takes sole ownership of all intellectual property, patents, and routing algorithms currently utilized by Aegis Logistics." The gallery gasped. "Mr. Sterling," Evelyn continued, unbothered by the noise, "will retain his shares in the operational shell of Aegis Logistics and maintain his role as CEO. However, Aegis Logistics has agreed to a permanent licensing agreement wherein they will pay Blue Heron Holdings 30% of their gross annual revenue for the rights to use the software." Judge Albright raised his eyebrows, a rare display of genuine astonishment. He looked down at Richard. "Mr. Sterling, do you understand that you are binding your company to your ex-wife's holding firm in perpetuity?" Richard slowly stood. The billionaire aura was entirely gone, replaced by the crushing reality of a man finally introduced to consequences. "I understand, Your Honor," he whispered. "Speak into the microphone, sir." "I understand. I agree to the terms." Judge Albright stared at him for a long, heavy moment. "Let me be clear. You attempted to use the legal system to financially abuse and dismiss a woman who was the undeniable architect of your success. If you would not sign this settlement, I would have forwarded today's transcripts to the federal prosecutor's office." Richard flinched, shrinking back. "Consider yourself fortunate that your ex-wife is far more pragmatic than you," Judge Albright concluded. He turned to Sarah, the severe lines of his face softening into profound respect. "Mrs. Sterling, you have endured character assassination, but today the truth was undeniably illuminated. You are a formidable architect. The court accepts this settlement. This marriage is dissolved. Crack. Adjourned. Chaos consumed Department 47. Reporters scrambled for the doors. Pendleton practically sprinted out, leaving his client alone. Sarah stood, buttoning her navy blazer. She didn't look at Richard. He was no longer a threat. He was just an employee on her payroll. "Ready?" Evelyn asked. "Yes." She walked down the center aisle, stepping into the flashing lights of the press, no longer the ghost in the machine, and never again just a housewife. Wow, talk about the ultimate courtroom takedown. Sarah didn't just get her fair share, she took the entire chessboard. If you were cheering for Sarah, as she outsmarted her arrogant billionaire ex-husband and proved she was the true mastermind behind the empire, smash that like button right now. Do you think Richard got what he deserved, or was Sarah's revenge too cold? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to share this incredible story of justice with your friends, and hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss another jaw-dropping real-life drama on our channel. See you in the next video.